Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about full range of motion training and why the majority of the time, it's usually the best option. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling on my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Now, when I say the majority of the time, obviously that means you can't always do it all the time. There are actually a lot of big exercises that don't work every muscle involved through the full range of motion due to various mechanical limitations. And there are a few exercises that it is actually dangerous to go through the full range of motion. But when we're talking about potential, the potential to recruit the most muscle fibers in a muscle, the longer you train the range of motion, the fuller range of motion you train a muscle through, the more potential you have to recruit the most muscle fibers. Now, does that automatically mean it's always going to be better? Does it automatically mean the muscle is going to grow the most if you train it through the full range of motion? No. But you're more likely, in many cases, yes, it will produce additional muscle growth. And it just has to do with the muscle itself, what its different origins and insertions are, how complex it is. Obviously, some muscles really need a couple of different exercises in order to reach their full size potential, their full strength potential, all of that. So we can't just look at that and say, well, if we just find one exercise and it works, a really complicated muscle like the latissimus dorsi or the deltoids do a full range of motion, that's obviously not going to get the job done. Some of these are complex muscles with multiple insertion points, multiple heads. It can get a little complicated. But generally speaking, a muscle is going to be able to recruit more muscle fibers if you have it perform its full function, because it will always have some muscle fibers that don't get worked through different points in the range of motion on an exercise. In other words, yeah, you'll see a bunch of guys who just do top curls. They'll get on a preacher curl bench and they'll do this, and actually they'll take load completely off at the top. They make it really easy at the top, and then they come part of the way down so they can use a heavier dumbbell to show off. But if they just use the lighter dumbbell and exhausted the muscle to the same extent going all the way down, the muscle will probably have done more work. It will get better overall muscle fiber recruitment. And that's the general idea. That's what you're looking for. If you want to make a muscle grow, working it through its full range of motion, even if that means using a slightly lighter weight, is probably going to produce slightly better results in terms of developing that muscle. The other thing to consider is joint angle specificity, strength, things like that. If you want a muscle to get as strong as possible, obviously training that muscle through its full range of motion is going to give you the most strength potential, and the reason being joint specificity carryover isn't absolute, meaning if you train an exercise purely through half of the range of motion, you're probably going to be a lot weaker on the other half. The strength that you gain through the full range of motion is not going to carry over anywhere near as much at the bottom. Strength carryover, like full carryover for performance, only travels about 15 degrees of a joint angle. Now a bicep, that's 180 degrees, right? So if you were to stop short down here, you're going to get weaker at the bottom. You're not going to get the strength carryover. And if you had been training full range of motion, you went to pure partials, you usually lose strength at the bottom. Case in point, it also is really more noticeable on big exercises. For example, it's not uncommon for people to go do partial bench presses on their chest, right? They'll do board presses, they'll do partials, whatever, and they skip the bottom 4 inches, right? They'll do purely a board press, or they'll do pin press work. If you were to do that for 4, 5, 6 weeks straight, and you got stronger at it, meaning you were able to only, you cut the range down so that you could go heavier. Let's say you started with being able to bench 275 for 3 reps, but you start doing partials with a board, and you get to where off of a pair of boards you could start doing 315 for reps immediately. Let's say you could do 315 for 3 reps when you start, and you build that up to being able to do 350 pounds for 3 to 5 reps, right? So you're like, I've gotten a lot stronger through the top 2/3 of that range of motion. I got a lot stronger. Went from 315 to say 355. So added 40 pounds to your rep work. When you go back and try the 275 again, let's say you did that over the course of 6 weeks, you're probably going to find that your max, when you actually have to touch your chest and pause at the bottom, you might find that your 3 rep max at 275, you can't even do a single anymore. It might just stick to your chest. Why? because you didn't train that range of motion. You might have gained a little size in the muscles, you got stronger through a different part of the range of motion, but because you didn't train the hardest part, the bottom, you got weaker there. And when you get weaker there, you're no longer capable of lifting the same amount of weight anymore. And I've seen this happen a few times with guys, and it's usually a big shock, a big surprise. So when we're talking about strength potential, if you actually want to be as strong as possible, you need to be strong at various joint angles. You don't want to be just strong at one thing. You want to be strong on various movements and exercises through their full range of motion. It's going to give you the best overall strength and carry over into everything that you do. It's going to make you stronger overall. It's going to make you stronger on a football field. It's going to make you stronger in a wrestling match, because you have fewer joint angles and things of major movements that your body can do, to where you actually have weak points in there. You don't have leverage weak points and things. It's going to make you stronger, and being stronger is never a bad thing. If you're already lifting weights and putting in X number of hours at the gym, you might as well get the full athletic ability of it, no matter what your goals are. But if your goals are athletic in any way, training all those different ranges of motion so that you aren't weak is probably a good idea. Although if you train in a specific sport, you might need to focus on certain ranges of motion a little more, and that's the difference. The other big thing is going to be injury prevention. People who train partials who get weak at certain ranges of motion also develop weaknesses in mobility. They develop weaknesses in mobility. And contrary to popular belief, people say things like, oh, lockouts are bad for your elbow joints. No, they're actually not. Heavy locking out with weights you're not capable of lifting might be. You know, if a guy can only bench 275 for 3 reps and he does a bunch of partials at the top with 365 pounds, and he's putting a heavier weight on the joints repeatedly than the joint would actually be able to handle under a normal load, then that might beat up the joints a little bit. But the 275, if he's capable of touching his chest and doing the full range of motion and he locks it every time, that is not going to aggravate your elbow joints. It's not going to inflame your tricep tendons. Most people who have sore elbows, it's usually because of their tricep extension choices. They make bad choices and use bad form on various tricep extensions because they saw some bodybuilder or someone do it, and that's what ends up aggravating their elbows. It's not locking out on their bench press. Now, that being said, full range of motion is also a way to bring up weak points, because most of our big size exercises, squats, rows, bench presses, deadlifts, overhead presses, these are your overall size builders. But because of certain mechanical limitations, these exercises don't always work everything through the full range of motion. Case in point, the bench press, when you come all the way down and touch your chest, is that the full range of motion? No, you could actually go a little deeper, actually safely, if you have your elbows in the right position. So the bench press, for example, particularly as your chest gets bigger and thicker, your range of motion gets reduced a little bit, right? If you've got a big, thick chest, unfortunately, the bench press gets less range of motion at the very bottom, which is again where the stretch is put there. You've got to stretch on the muscle there. That's why some guys who stall at a certain point with their bench press, their chest development doesn't seem to progress much at a certain point for them. When they go over to dumbbells, they notice that their chest starts growing again. The reason with the dumbbells, for most guys with a big chest, you can get 2 or 3 inches lower with the dumbbells while keeping them to the side. Not talking about out here, this crazy stuff that destroys your shoulder joints. When they come down with the dumbbells here, their rib cage and pecs don't get in the way as much. They can go a little deeper while still being at the safe range of motion. The reason dumbbells for chest exercises for people who struggle with chest is not because you're working each side independently. That's all nonsense. That doesn't actually balance anything. That's a myth. People who don't understand exercise mechanics. Nothing to do with balancing your left or right. You can get just as imbalanced with dumbbells as you can with a barbell. The thing that's going on there, though, a lot of those guys, due to range of motion of the barbell, they get less range of motion at the bottom, which is where the chest really has to work the hardest, because as they get bigger and thicker, it starts limiting the range of motion on the bottom. So when they go to dumbbells, all of a sudden they're stimulating the muscle through the full range of motion and their chest starts growing again. That's all it is. And in some cases, that's where finding a different range of motion will help. A lot of exercises like the deadlift work a lot of muscles in the body, but some of those muscles to get worked better, particularly things like the hamstrings and some stuff, if you start doing deficit deadlifts to where you stand on a, maybe wear 1-inch boots like I do, 1-inch thick heels, or you start standing on plates or blocks or something to put yourself another 2 or 3 inches higher off the floor, it increases the range of motion slightly on the deadlift. It improves the range of motion at the hardest part for a couple of different muscles in the body, like your posterior chain, and therefore it might start growing again if you feel like you're underdeveloped there. And you can safely do a deficit deadlift. Sometimes your hamstrings and glutes and stuff will start getting additional development again from doing that because you added range of motion. So there are definitely cases to where you can do things like that and it will start bringing up a lagging muscle. Any muscle that you have lagging that really seems to be a weak point for you athletically, aesthetically, whatever, there's a good chance you're not training it through the full range of motion. And if you go find another exercise that you can work it through the full range of motion and you start doing that, that will usually start bringing up a lagging body part. The only other thing to consider also is the risk of injury, and that's the problem we run into. Though training partials, again, makes you weak at certain points of the range of motion and it can reduce mobility. What happens when you accidentally, for some reason, are forced to move a weight through a full range of motion? Let's say you've been doing partials on the bench press, you stop short of your chest, you've been doing that for 6 months or a year with a weight that you can't touch your chest with and pause. What happens if the spotter messes up or you dip too low? You haven't trained yourself to be strong at that bottom. You've probably lost mobility, you've lost flexibility, and you've lost strength through that range of motion. Your odds of tearing something go up dramatically at that point. They go up dramatically at that point. So it's generally safer and better for you to train these exercises through the full range of motion. You're actually less likely to get injured unless it's an exercise that can put you into a compromised position, like the dip. Weighted dip is an example of an exercise to where if you go all the way as deep as you can at the bottom, you can actually overextend joints from the shoulder because of a complex joint like the shoulder joint. So that is something to consider. There's our mobility issues to where it isn't a natural range of motion anymore for certain muscles. Shoulder joints tend to be one of those. So the dip is an example of something that you can technically go so far that it becomes dangerous. But with a barbell bench press, not really the case, because the bar will be stopped by your chest. The same part of the exercise that makes it become more of a partial as you get bigger is also a built-in safety mechanism to keep you from going to a dangerous range of motion, to extending a joint further than it's really intended to go. Whereas in the dip, which is a very similar plane of motion, can extend the shoulder joints down deep enough because your body goes between the bars to a point to where it can actually compromise the shoulder joint. But all in all, you're going to find it's generally better to find exercises, particularly if you've got muscles that are lagging, you're really focusing on bringing up for some reason. It's usually best to make sure you're training that muscle through the fullest range of motion possible, because you're going to get the best possible muscle fiber recruitment. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.